Hello, welcome to his house. This is week 2 of the winter semester. We actually had technical difficulties with the camera on Tuesday night, so here's a re-recording of that message. So how many of you have a vehicle that tells you approximately how many miles till empty? One time I hit about -5 miles on a vehicle I was driving. And it didn't actually say negative. It went to 0, and then I was watching the odometer to see how far, and went about another 5 miles. And by the way, I did make it to the gas station that time. But oftentimes, I am in the teens to single digits in my miles till empty before I fill up. Does anyone else flirt with empty like that with their gas tank? A lot of people raised their hands on Tuesday night. How about flirting with empty in your daily personal energy levels? And when we do that, it's stressful. Of course, it's exhausting. And sometimes we hit E and we burn out. Or maybe we're at the other end of the spectrum. Instead of always going, we're not really motivated to do anything. There is a happy medium in there. You may have a tendency to be tempted a little more toward one end or the other, or maybe both, like me, depending on the season. The beginning of a new calendar year, a new semester, is a great time to address this, and that's what we're doing. We're in week 2 of a 4-week series called Sustainable. Last week we introduced the series with the idea of cultivating our love for Jesus. A big part of our sustainability is being fueled by God, not just ourselves. An active relationship with Jesus fuels us. He helps us to have a sustainable pace in life. And if you missed it, you can watch week one's message on YouTube as well. Another major component of our sustainability has to do with the way we use our time and energy. We could do so much with time management concepts, but if we just figured out how to use our time more efficiently, we might just try to cram more stuff into our schedule, which would defeat the purpose of this series. So instead of a direct focus on time management for tonight, we're going to focus on the key components of margin and rest. So that's our title for tonight: choosing rest and margin. In order to apply rest and margin in our schedules, of course, many of us will need to apply some time management skills. And if you'd be interested in digging deeper into time management in general, message me on the side and I can recommend a few books or podcasts about that. We're going to start tonight with a passage in the New Testament about time and managing our time. So please open a Bible or Bible app to Ephesians 5, verses 15 through 17. Ephesians 5, 15 through 17 says, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." I think it's safe to say that it's unwise to live a stagnant life. It's unwise to keep burning out. It's unwise to be constantly running on empty. But the days are evil, the passage tells us, and we know this firsthand. We're going to keep being tempted toward those things, so let's intentionally make the best use of our time. And let's not be foolish about that, but try to understand what God's will is. So that's our framework for tonight. Being wise with our time and energy will hopefully lead us to pursue rest and margin. But how can rest and margin be the best use of my time? I've got stuff to do. Well, hopefully we'll see about that. Turn over to the Old Testament. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 17. Let me set up the context. Back in Exodus chapter 20, God audibly spoke the 10 commandments to the whole nation of Israel. He didn't just tell Moses, he told everybody out loud. Commandment 4 was about the Sabbath. Do all your work in 6 days and rest on the 7th day. And when Israel heard God speak the 10 commandments, they freaked out and they told Moses, just have God tell you what he wants, and you relate that to us because that scared us to death. So Moses goes back up Mount Sinai, and God lays out a whole bunch of additional laws from the end of chapter 20 through chapter 31. So we're going to look at the end of that conversation. We're going to pick up in Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17. And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy to you." Then he goes into the consequences of violating the Sabbath, which is the death sentence. Seems pretty harsh to us. So let's skip ahead to verse 17. He said, "It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." Now let me just clarify something that we'll come back to this passage. The New Testament contains God's laws for Christians, his commandments for Christians. The Old Testament, especially the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy, contained God's law for the Jews, especially the pre-Christian Jews. Acts 15 tells us pretty clearly that Christians don't have to follow the Old Testament law, but any Old Testament law that was recommanded in the New Testament would still apply, because then it's in the New Testament, such as most of the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath is referred to many times in the New Testament, but never actually instructed or commanded for Christians to obey. So the Sabbath is not law for Christians. You're not sinning by keeping the Sabbath. It's still wise and fruitful as part of making the best use of our time, but Sabbath isn't law. No one's going to come after you with the death penalty for not keeping the Sabbath, thankfully. So the Sabbath isn't law for Christians, but it's wise and fruitful. Let me just fix the screen here. Okay, we're here. Sabbath isn't law for Christians, but it's unwise, but it's wise and fruitful. Now let's get back to Exodus 31. After 11 chapters of Old Testament laws, in addition to the Ten Commandments, in verse 13, God told Moses, "Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths." Above all. But wait, if I was following along in the NIV, it doesn't say that. Neither does the Christian Standard Bible or Holderman Christian Standard. But the English Standard Version, which I read, does. The New American Standard says, "Surely you shall surely observe my Sabbaths." In the original Hebrew language, there's a word there. I had an app pronounce it for me. It kind of sounds like you're disgusted with something. And the word is ach. Ach means only, nevertheless, but, surely, however, along those lines. Some translations just kind of gloss over that word, but the ESV and the NASB acknowledge it and try to convey the meaning of it to us. So after the 10 commandments and 11 additional chapters of commandments, God circles back and highlights one of those. And this ach word seems to reinforce that. And the one commandment he circles back to highlight isn't commandment number 1 from the 10 commandments about no other gods. It's not commandment number 2, which was about not making idols, which is kind of weird because while this conversation was happening between God and Moses, the Israelites were actively breaking commandments 1 and 2 by casting a golden calf idol and calling it Elohim, one of the words for God that we looked at last week. But he doesn't highlight one of those or any of the other commandments from those 11 chapters. Instead, he reinforces commandment number 4 about keeping the Sabbath. That tells me God put something special in this idea of Sabbath. At the end of verse 13 in Exodus 31, God gives a reason for it. He said, "That you may know that I, Yahweh, sanctify you," or "I am the Lord who makes you holy." In other words, a habit of rest can acknowledge that God is the one who makes us better. A habit of rest can acknowledge that God is the one who makes us better. It's not our striving that makes us better, not our performance, not our busyness, not our accomplishment or our grades or paycheck or number of social media followers. God is the one who makes us better. He sanctifies us. He makes us holy. He makes us more good. That's why the Sabbath was highlighted among this first round of Old Testament commandments. The greatest commandment, that which we looked at last week, about loving God with all your heart and soul and strength, came later on in the book of Deuteronomy. Resting shows our trust in God, that we can cease from our work for a time and it'll be okay. And actually, it'll be better as a result. Verse 17 said that on the seventh day, God rested and was refreshed. Our eternal, all-powerful God didn't need rest and refreshment, but he did it as an example for us to follow. We do need rest and refreshment. We need to replenish our reserves. We need to fill our tanks. And God designed the human body in general to require 8 hours of sleep per day to replenish our physical energy. But things like our nutrition and exercise definitely play into that too, to either replenish or deplete. In general, the ways we spend or replenish our physical energy are pretty straightforward. But we use more than physical energy during the day. We have other energy tanks that need to be replenished too. So what about our mental energy, our emotional energy, our spiritual energy? Let's say I get 8 hours of sleep every night. I eat fairly healthy and move some. But every waking moment of my day is filled with spending various kinds of energy, not just physical energy. I should be fine physically, but when will my mental, emotional, and spiritual energy tanks be refreshed and replenished? For example, my God time that I spend reading the Bible or praying, that's rest time for me. Even though I'm doing something, things like that fill my spiritual energy tank. Well, while things like preparing for a message, delivering a message, it's exciting while it's happening, but at the end I'm kind of spent. Or pouring into a hurting person, those things spend my spiritual energy. But we're all wired differently. Someone who's an extrovert and gifted in compassion and mercy, you may actually be energized by pouring into a hurting person. Things like studying, doing reading homework, planning out details, administrative tasks, those spend my mental energy. But things like puzzles or creative brainstorming or listening to a good podcast or audiobook, those are filling for my mental and creative energy. Again, that mix might look a little different for you. But filling activities could be considered rest even though they're doing something. Filling activities could be considered rest even though they're doing something. So practicing Sabbath or being intentional with our waking rest doesn't mean we have to sit there and do nothing. It means that we're not working, we're not doing work, but we're doing more of the things that fill us rather than just the things that we spend energy on. So making the best sustainable use of our time involves making sure our energy coming in matches our energy going out. Making the best sustainable use of our time involves making sure our energy coming in matches our energy going out. That's what having enough rest does. But if we don't replenish our energy in those various categories, sooner or later, we're going to hit empty. So let's flip back over to the New Testament, Matthew 11, verses 27 through 30. Matthew 11, 27 through 30, Jesus said, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." At the end of Matthew 28, verse 18, Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And then he gives us the Great Commission. He prefaced that very important mission with his authority to give it. Here in Matthew 11, he just says all. Not just all authority, but he says all, everything has been delivered to me by my Father. And he talks about the special relationship he has with God the Father. And it really seems like he's about to lay out something super important. Then he says in verse 28, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The Greek word for rest there is actually a verb. So he says, I will refresh you. I will replenish you. I will give rest to you. Coming to him is how we do that. Cultivating a relationship with Jesus. So that fits right in with week 1's message. So the Sabbath instruction fits in with that as well. We can find rest when we acknowledge that Jesus is the one who makes us better. Come to Jesus and find rest. And he prefaced that with the statement that all has been delivered into his hands, has been delivered over to him. So Jesus has the authority to speak rest into my schedule. Jesus has the authority to speak rest into my schedule. He's not just some random person hearing what we're doing saying, oh, you should probably get some rest. And our response to that might be, well, thanks, but I don't have time for rest. But Jesus has the authority to speak that into our lives. He doesn't force it, he invites it. And he's saying, stop trying to do everything in your own strength. This will be good and refreshing for you. And I'll help you experience it. Just trust me with it. And we can trust that a Jesus-present rest will yield better results than skipping that rest in our own strength and busyness. So continuing in verse 29, he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Not only does he want us to rest and be replenished, but even in our work, if we rely on him in the midst of it, that can be energizing. Maybe not physically, but spiritually. Rest for our souls. There, Jesus is acknowledging that idea of these other energy levels that need to be refilled. He acknowledges the spiritual energy. So partnering with Jesus in our work, and even better in his work, is a light burden. And that word for light doesn't mean it's a little bit lighter comparatively to the other. It means it's slight, it's insignificant. So if we have the mindset of teaming up with Jesus in work, it might feel like we're barely exerting energy, which makes the replenishment even easier. So to sum up what we've learned about rest, Jesus invites us to rest. He helps us experience that rest. He blesses rest and calls it holy. He makes us holy through it. And rest is a way we can acknowledge who he is and demonstrate our trust in him. But Troy, you don't know my schedule this semester, class or work, the expectations my family puts on me. How can I intentionally rest when my schedule is so full? Well, there are seasons when we have a lot going on, more so than others. I get that. Even Jesus experienced that. In Mark 6 verses 30 through 46, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So that's a pretty hectic schedule. The context of that is that Jesus had just learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. So he's got a lot of, not just the physical energy being spent, he's got a lot of emotional energy that's been drained. So Jesus invites his disciples to join him in seeking a quiet place where they could recharge. Let's continue in verse 32. "And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So their attempt at rest got hijacked. Maybe you've experienced that part. You had plans to rest, but then something came up and you didn't, and you couldn't. But even though their rest was postponed, their plans had to change, Jesus recognized that as a God opportunity. The opportunity turned into the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus took a couple fish and a couple loaves of bread and fed 5,000 men and their families. Then at the end of the day, we pick up the story in verse 45. It says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. So Jesus found that rest later on. It wasn't his first choice of when he wanted to do it, but he still pursued it because he needed that recharging. That's where the idea of rest comes in the idea of margin comes in super handy. Jesus didn't have events scheduled at certain times like we do today, like work hours or class hours or meeting up with someone at a very specific time. So if we have a little cushion scheduled in, it's a lot easier to recognize and take advantage of those God opportunities that we weren't planning on. Divine appointments, things that God had on your calendar that you didn't realize were on your calendar. So margin also leaves room for practical things like, oh, I need to fill up my gas tank before I arrive at my destination. Planning margin into our schedule increases our flexibility and decreases our anxiety. Planning margin into our schedule increases our flexibility and decreases our anxiety. Of course, there are seasons when we have to work a ton of hours or have a bunch of schoolwork to do or back-to-back classes or meetings all day. I get that. But there are also seasons when we don't have that, yet somehow we feel just as busy and we don't know where the time went. Do you know what I'm talking about? Everybody nodded on Tuesday night. Like I said earlier, there are some tools. There are a ton of tools for time management, but let me give you one. Some of you have seen this chart before, but it's always helpful for me to be reminded of it. It's the urgent, important matrix. So we got columns of urgent and not urgent. We have rows of important and not important. So box one, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. We usually don't have a problem with box one. If something's urgent and it's important, people tend to be on top of that. The unimportant things in box 3 distract us, like a notification on your phone. And so you look at your phone because it's urgent, because the ding or the vibration just happened, and then you wonder what happened to the last 20 minutes or the last hour. A great example of box 4 would be aimlessly pulling out your phone because you had a spare moment, even without a notification or looking for something specific. Box 2 might include things like rest. It's super important, but it's not urgent until you reach empty, and then it becomes urgent. Most people don't spend enough time on things in box 2 that are important but not urgent, and don't realize what a time and energy drain boxes 3 and 4 are. So here's a general action plan for when you realize the importance and urgency of things that take your time and energy. We've got some instructions here. In box 1, do it first. Prioritize it. In box 2, schedule it. If it's urgent but not important, schedule it. Box 3, delegate it. And box 4, try to eliminate it. And you can have some grace with those instructions, but that's a rule of thumb. So to help avoid some of those not so important boxes, and thereby create space for rest and the activities that fill you, here are a few very practical suggestions. The first one, use a planner or calendar app that goes along with the schedule it part. Have it remind you of things. Have it things on your radar like, oh yeah, this is important, so I'm making time for it. Next, set up short screen time limits on social media or news apps. I have a combined total of 30 minutes per day for social media. I have like a little bit more for Instagram and just a tiny bit for Facebook, and that makes up my social media for the day. I don't scroll through videos, and that really helps. And I imagine if you try to implement this, you'll be shocked at how quickly the time goes by at first, but then you get adjusted to it. Box 3, or suggestion 3 here, is limit checking email to 1 to 2 times a day. I know some of us, we see the little notification on our phone or on our computer and like, oh, we got to get in there and clear out those notifications. But that might happen many, many, many times during the day. So just check it once, clear it out if you're into that, or just ignore it if you're into that. And then let it build up again. And the next day, go in and clear it out, and it will be okay. And the other suggestion is create a to-don't list. It's not a to-do list, it's a to-don't list. You can apply that especially to everything in box 4 and a few things from box 3. If we applied these things, most of us would be amazed at how much time and energy we suddenly found in our schedule. And we'd be able to make some time for God-honoring rest. Let me encourage us to not flirt with empty in our energy levels this semester. Let's honor God with a sustainable pace. And you can do that by cultivating your love for Jesus and by choosing rest and margin. And we're going to learn 2 more components of that in the next couple weeks. Thanks. Let me put up the discussion questions if you have an opportunity to do that. I'll read through those. Our discussion questions: share your name and favorite hobby. If you have a chance to do that with someone, that's great, or just read through them yourself. Between your physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy tanks, which currently seems the most filled? And explain that briefly. Which energy tank seems closest to empty, and why? What are things you could do to fill that tank, that energize you in that area? And then the last question, what important but non-urgent things do you need to schedule? Okay, one more question. What do you need to add to your to-don't list? And then pray through that. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.